Thank you so much, and thank you to the MAC for having me today to talk about Worthington history. This is really exciting for me. Often when I get to talk about Worthington history for groups, I say, how much time do you want? Cross my fingers that I get 30 minutes, and they say maybe 15, and there's so much great history, so today we get to actually dive into more detail, and I'm really looking forward to it. So hopefully some of this might be familiar, but hopefully there's also some things that are new to you. So when I think about, okay, let's see. Okay, there we go. All right, so I always like to make sure we start talking about the fact that we drive into Worthington and everything says established in 1803, but there have been people in this area far longer than the last 220 years. And one evidence of that is the Jeffers Mound, which is over on Pleasanton Drive. And it was built by people from the Hopewell culture, roughly between 100 BC and 400 AD. And the mound that is still on Pleasanton Drive that is taken care of by the Historical Society is actually just one part of a larger earthwork complex that was here. This map from 1848 shows the large square earthwork, and then there are some C shapes and circle shapes off to the side, a mound in the middle, and then the big mound at the bottom that has the red circle is what's still there. If you're interested in learning more about this earthwork and earthworks in general, Dr. Brad Lepper from the Ohio History Connection is doing a presentation here next Thursday in conjunction with the Historical Society, the MAC, and the library. So you can get into lots of detail about that next week. All right, so when we think of Worthington history, the Worthington that we know, James Kilbourne is definitely the name that pops to mind first. He lived in Connecticut and organized a group called the Scioto Company in early 1800. And he was basically looking for families and to subscribe to the company so they would pay in money and then find land in Ohio to establish a new town. Different than some of the other companies, it was a requirement in the Scioto Company that you were going to settle here. You couldn't speculate. If you bought in and then didn't come and settle in a certain amount of time, you forfeited your land back to the company. So there were people in the Scioto Company that were from Blandford, Granby, Simsbury, Hartford, Berlin, all that area in Connecticut and Massachusetts. There were 40 total families. And in 1802, James Kilbourne and Nathaniel Little traveled west to Ohio, which was still part of the Northwest Territory. They expected it was going to get statehood soon, and they were looking for what land they would purchase. And so they took boats and horses. They did not drive, and ended up in the Chillicothe area where Thomas Worthington was a land agent, and he was selling land for the U.S. government, and he showed them land in the Chillicothe area. They were set to buy some land there, and then we're not sure exactly what happened, but later notes show that by the time they got back to Connecticut, they recommended, James Kilbourne and Nathaniel Little recommended to the group they buy land further north, land that they never visited, on the high banks of the Olentangy River, because it seems Thomas Worthington relayed to them that the land on the higher banks had better drainage, so there was less chance of contracting illnesses from insects and the swampy lands down near Chillicothe. So they ended up purchasing 16,000 acres for $1.25 an acre. And so you can see there's the 8,000 contiguous acres that were the west half of Sharon Township, and that is what they considered Worthington, and in large part is now Worthington. That runs up to Lozelle Road, down to Bethel Road, just west of the river, and then over towards where 71 is now. And then they also bought 4,000 acres in Clinton Township, and then 4,000 acres north, I want to say that was in Liberty Township. And those 2 extra parcels were used to sell off land to support the Scioto Company. And when they got here, there was already a local government established. There were 2 township justices of the peace. So when they got here, they weren't in charge of their own government, but eventually Ezra Griswold and other people became justices of the peace from the Worthington community. And so here are 2 maps. The map on the left shows, you can see the town is at the bottom with the town square in the middle. Those were the town lots, and then all the farm lots that filled out the rest of Sharon, the west half of Sharon Township. And then the map on the right, which is both of these are part of the Historical Society's collections, was an early drawing of the 164 town lots that made up Worthington as a town. So they had these 160 town lots. They were bounded by North Street, South Street, Morning and Evening Street. They planned ahead before they ever left the East Coast that they would have 160 lots that were about 3/4 of an acre each. And then they reserved 2 lots for an Episcopal church and 2 lots for a school. So you can see that they planned out to have the village green in the middle, 5 acres, and then lots B and C were for the church, and D and E were for the school. And they knew from the beginning that their town was going to have a school, they were going to have a church, they knew they were going to have a library. They asked everybody who subscribed, each family that subscribed, to pay $2 to purchase books that they would bring with them. And we mentioned that with our 3rd grade students at their field trips, and I had a 3rd grader say, that means that they paid more for books than they did for an acre of land, which I thought that kiddo was on it. And so that was impressive. But also, like, that's a really good observation that land was so abundant here, but books on the frontier were not. And they knew that they wanted to come to establish this new town, but have a culture and be able to educate their children. And so that was one of the very valuable to them. And you can also notice on that map, some of the street names are different. So like North Street was called Greenwich on one side and Village on the other. South Street was called Windsor and Olive. Only Evening Street and Hartford Street stayed the same, I think. So they've all changed largely in the 1920s. So in September of 1803, the Scioto Company, the families all loaded up and made the journey to Worthington. It was 700 miles, and the fastest group got here in 6 weeks. And the legend that is always told is that the Griswolds used oxen instead of horses, and that Granny Griswold suggested that because the oxen are slower, but they're stronger, and they could navigate the mountains better than the horses. So they got here first in 6 weeks. And when you consider there was nothing waiting for them here, and they had to bring all of their belongings, children were walking next to the wagon, family members were walking because their wagons were loaded up. There are letters where a woman recalls as a child walking here and her tears freezing to her face. This was an arduous journey. They left in September. Some didn't get here until December because that would be there'd be less chance of contracting illnesses that would be prevalent in the summer. And one of the last couples to get here was James Kilbourne and his wife Lucy, because they stopped in Camp Washington, Pennsylvania, so that she could give birth. So they needed a few days before they got back on the road. So the Scioto Company arrives in Worthington. They had sent an advance party out in the summer, some young men to start clearing land and build some very crude cabins. Descriptions of the cabins that were written by people later say that they had dirt floors with a hole in the roof in the middle so that they could have their fire in the middle, smoke go out the top, that they could see through the logs and the roof. So the first winter was certainly difficult. But in February of 1804, they'd been here for 3 or 4 months. School began, and it was a subscription school, so if you wanted to send your children, you had to pay us into the subscription. But they had classes beginning in February of 1804 in that building on the public square. That building also, it's always described as a double wide log cabin, and was where they held meetings and church services. And so just to give a kind of perspective on what Worthington, the people of the Scioto Company in Worthington were hoping for their community, they attempted to win the bid for Worthington to be the state capital. There were three main contenders. Columbus and Dublin were the other two. And in 1810, they pledged $25,334 from 136 people, plus land to build the capital here in Worthington. And again, when they bought all of that land for $16,000, they raised a significant amount. I mean, they were really hoping that the capital would be here, in which case our charming town of Worthington we would not be sitting here. So, but that was their goal. All right, so I'm going to talk about some of the older buildings that we still have here and some that are gone, just to kind of give a flavor of how Worthington developed. So this building, which I realize this picture is pretty old now, since it has the curio cabinet. We've been through a few businesses there, but is the Kilbourne Commercial Building. It was constructed in 1808, so it's the oldest brick building in Central Ohio on its original foundation that's still here. And James Kilbourne erected this building, and it has 3 front doors, and they had 3 different businesses in there. He was a surveyor, so he surveyed Worthington and laid out the maps, but also surveyed Bucyrus, Sandusky, Lockbourne, Kilbourne, other communities all the way up to Lake Erie. So his surveying office was in one of the sections. He also had the Western Intelligencer, which was the first newspaper in Franklin County. The printing press was in that building, and it started in July of 1811. And then the last section was for a dry goods store that would provide the community with products that they needed. And then the second floor was used for housing. The Kilbournes actually had a house that was where the coffee shop is now, on the corner of the Village Green. But James Kilbourne came with his wife, Lucy. They had a number of children. She passed away. He married Cynthia Goodale Barnes, who had already been married and had children. And then Cynthia and James had more children. So at one time, they had about 14 kids living with them. So they used the second floor of the commercial building that attached to the house where the coffee shop is as additional residence. See. Okay, and then another name that should be familiar is the Griswold Tavern. So the Griswold family, who were part of the original Scioto Company that came in 1803, started keeping a public house on the Village Green in their house right away in 1803. They had to apply for a license. And then they officially built the Griswold Tavern brick building on the northeast Village Green in 1811. And I'm guessing a lot of you probably know where that was, but it was where the Huntington Bank is now. And the Griswold family lived in that house from 1811 until 1965. Early on, it was a center for activity and gatherings for the community. We have this invitation at the top to Miss Mila Thompson for the New Year's Ball. And George Griswold, who was the second generation Griswold to come, was one of the managers, along with Aurora Buttles. Aurora Buttles, well, I'll talk about him in a little bit. So they would have New Year's balls, 4th of July gatherings, a lot of events at Esquire Griswold's. Another interesting tidbit about Ezra Griswold: on the frontier in the early 1800s, as you might imagine, having coinage and physical money was often hard. So a lot of people did business by bartering and keeping accounts. But Ezra Griswold also started issuing scrip. So he could order these blanks and then fill them out. And when he would need to give change to people, he used his own script. And this was a pretty big one. He was one of the people who issued a lot more script than other people. We have boxes full, and recently received another box full from the Ohio History Connection because they decided they have too much. People still call us and say, I have this piece that the last person who lived in the Griswold Inn, Ruth Griswold, apparently gave out pieces of script at Halloween, if people stopped to visit, she gave some out. So there is lots of it. It's been reported that they accepted it even as far east as Western New York, that people recognized the Griswold name and it meant something, and so this was accepted all over Ohio and further abroad, afield. So this picture is a picture of Ruth Griswold. So she was the matriarch that came here. We suspect that she put on her early pioneer bonnet later in life because she was in her 30s when she came. So for this portrait, but this portrait is in the Orange Johnson house, and it's one of the many items when the Griswold Inn was torn down. Was when the Orange Johnson house was being restored. And so our museum was a ready place for the Griswold family to donate a lot of items so people can continue to learn about their family. And then I included some other pictures. So there were 5 generations of Griswolds that lived in the inn. So Ezra and Ruth came with their family. George was one of their sons who continued to live in the house. And then George had a son. I think he only had one son, and his name was Worthington Franklin Griswold, just in case you forgot where he was from. And so he was the 3rd generation. He married Fondelia Ruth Griswold, and then they had 14 children. So they had been using the Griswold Inn as an inn up until that point, but at the time that Worthington Franklin's family outgrew their residence, they kind of took over the whole inn. So here are 10 of the 14 Griswold children standing at different places in front of the house. And then Edith and Ruth, Ruth Griswold on the right was the last person to live in the house, and she moved to California with Edith in 1964. And so this is the time they're closing the door for the last time. And then the building was razed. So a lot of people still remember and miss the Griswold Inn. So I'm gonna briefly jump over to the Worthington Manufacturing Company. So if you're familiar with where Fox Lane is on the Olentangy River at the bottom of South Street, James Kilbourne created this manufacturing company, and he was definitely a big dreamer. You know, they were hoping this would become the capital. When that didn't work out, they started the manufacturing company. Worthington has so much raw materials. They come out here, there are so many trees. There's this river where they can set up a mill, and every time James Kilbourne went back east, he recruited more craftsmen and artisans to come to Worthington and join the Worthington Manufacturing Company. So they had Factory Street, Mechanic Square, Garden Square, all sorts of different, like a tinsmith, a cooper, a hornsmith, cabinet makers. All these different people had property down here to build goods that they would then ship up to Lake Erie and be able to send goods to the east and hopefully to Europe and all these different places. They provided supplies for the militia in the War of 1812. Unfortunately, Kilbourne made all these plans, he got all these things going, but he wasn't necessarily great with money. So there was a crash in 1818 and the Worthington Manufacturing Company went bankrupt. So it was relatively short-lived, but we do have pieces of furniture that were built there at the Orange Johnson house. And it was where a lot of people in Worthington got their start in business. And there was a boarding house down there. This house is still standing, built in 1814, that housed workers when they arrived to work at the company. Later, it was used to house people during, this was Camp Lyon during the Civil War, and then different families have lived there, and now it is a lovely home. Another early building that is still standing right on High Street is the Masonic Lodge. It was constructed in 1820, and many of the men who lived in Worthington were involved in the Masons and supported each other through that organization. This was one of the buildings that was built by Aurora Buttles. He was a brick mason, started out as an apprentice, and the person who he was apprenticing died very early on in his apprenticeship. So he was able to become the Worthington's primary brick mason pretty young. So he built the Masonic Lodge. He built both sections of the Orange Johnson House. He was involved in the building of St. John's Episcopal Church. He was involved in building a house that was where the parking lot of Graders is, possibly the Snow House, which would have been one of his earlier endeavors, which may be evident in the fact that it's a little wonky. But luckily, we have people who've held on to some of these early brick structures. So then we'll move to the Columbus-Sandusky Turnpike. So Kilbourne is still looking to create this trade through Lake Erie, and there was a stagecoach route that followed old Indian trails, and it went kind of went off to the left and then up to Sandusky. It wasn't very direct, and so he organized and surveyed to build this Columbus-Sandusky Turnpike that would go in a more direct route and would operate as a toll road. And Orange Johnson was brought on to be the superintendent of that project. And it was kind of a flop. There was a reason those old trails went to the left instead of through swamps. And so the turnpike was almost constantly muddy and impassable and didn't really pan out the way it was hoped. But that is where Kilbourne and Orange Johnson started working together and helped Orange Johnson make connections, start investing in real estate, and being active in the community. So hopefully you're all familiar with the Orange Johnson House. If you haven't been there, we would love to have you visit. And we always remind people when they're not sure that it's right by the Dairy Queen, because everyone knows where the Dairy Queen is. So this was the back part of the house that you can't see in this picture was built by Aurora Buttles in 1811. He was about 18 years old when he got the land. When his father, Levi, brought the family here in 1804. He was involved with the Granville Licking Company as well as the Scioto Company. Apparently, Levi Buttles was traveling to Granville and got caught in a snowstorm in April and then contracted pneumonia and passed away very early, leaving behind a wife and a number of children. That's when Aurora Buttles was like 11 years old. And this land was in probate for a long time. It was his Levi Buttles farm lot. But once Aurora got control, he built the back half of the house, listed it in the newspaper for sale, and then eventually Orange Johnson purchased it and had Aurora Buttles come back and build this more grand federal addition on the front. So Orange Johnson and his wife Axa raised 3 children. They had 3 children, one who died in infancy, a son who lived to be age 20, and then Mary Johnson, who lived to be 96. And Mary was raised in the house here in Worthington, attended school here in Worthington, and then married a man named Francis Sessions. And Francis Sessions was a partner with Orange Johnson in opening a bank in Columbus and invested in real estate. So he built this large, gorgeous mansion on Broad Street. When Mary died, the land was given to create the Columbus Gallery of Arts. And the front door of their mansion is still on the property on a little side building, but the house was torn down. So I always like to think about how, they came here, lived in this little brick house that we still take care of and invite people in, but the legacy can be seen at the Columbus Gallery of Arts or Columbus Museum of Art, and then they also funded to begin what is now CCAD. Okay, so another Aurora Buttles, at least he was involved in building the St. John's Episcopal Church, and so first of all, I just think this is amazing because the picture was taken in 1859, so photography was still really in its infancy. The church took 4 years to build. So when the Scioto Company gets here, they already knew they were going to have an Episcopal church. They're holding services in this log cabin. The Methodists and the Presbyterians arrive. Early on, they build churches. And the Episcopal Church just kept meeting in the meeting house. And they were the last of the 3 congregations to get a building constructed. But it still sits right on the village green. And a little bit of interesting history about their early days. If you've heard of Philander Chase, he was brought to Worthington in 1817 by James Kilbourne. They gave him the title of the Episcopal Bishop of Ohio to help lure him here. And also he was hired as the principal of the Worthington Academy. And the Worthington Academy was the first school that was located on the village green on the lots for this school. And he had a very fiery personality. You can find diaries of people who had him as an educator and talked about how he was really strict and used a lot of punishment techniques that would definitely cause him to lose his job now. And then he also had a large ego, and James Kilbourne had a large ego, and they struggled. There was definitely a power struggle of who was really in charge of the church and the Worthington community. And so he had started teaching at the Worthington Academy and then formed what became Kenyon College, and he took the school to Gambier. All right, so in 1835, Worthington was incorporated as a town, and that changed the government structure to be having a mayor and a recorder and 5 trustees. And just briefly, we'll talk about the Anti-Slavery Society. It was formed in 1835. 66 members signed the Constitution. There were 500 people in Worthington at that point. 24 of the people that signed were women. Important names, people who signed that Constitution include William Spencer, Abner Pinney, they were both council trustees, Ozam Gardner and Ansel Mattoon, who were both active in the Underground Railroad. I did a little more research recently into who these people were, and within a few years, almost all of them had moved to Iowa or Illinois. And in those 66 members, some of the families had 10 family members and 8 of their children signed. So I think when we first talked about, that this is pretty great, 66 members, but I think it is a little misleading about the Worthington community and who was signing that Constitution and who was putting their name out there that they were active with the Anti-Slavery Society. They met at Ansel Mattoon's house. So if you're familiar on North Street, this house is behind the Dairy Queen. There's a picture or a map from 1856. The arrow points to where the house was located at the corner of North Street and High Street. And you can see Orange Johnson's house up here, so kind of catty corner from that. And there's a picture of the house in 1940. It was moved from where it was located to behind the Dairy Queen in the early 1900s. But the Constitution for this anti-slavery society said their objective was the emancipation of the colored man from the oppression of public sentiment and unjust laws, and the elevation of both the enslaved and free blacks to an intellectual and moral equality with whites. And then in the 1837 notes, they said, "We pledge ourselves to support no man for any office in these United States who is publicly opposed to the immortal sentiment set forth in the Declaration of our Independence, viz. That all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. That among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." So Ansel Mattoon and Ozem Gardner were both involved in that organization. Ansel Mattoon made wagons and wheels, and Ozem Gardner was a farmer up on Flint Road. So Mattoon had reason to be taking wagons, repairing wheels, going north to Flint with those wagons. And then Ozem Gardner had a big property on Flint Road. The house is still standing. It's now owned by the Walnut Grove and Flint cemeteries. So that's kind of nice that building will continue to be preserved. If you've ever been up there, behind the Ozem Gardner house, if you're standing in the cemetery and you look across the creek, you can see this little shelter built into the embankment, and that was used by Ozem Gardner to conceal people on the Underground Railroad. So Ansel Mattoon and other people from Clinton Township would be able to come up to Flint Road, and Ozem Gardner would keep them and then help move them towards freedom, either towards Westerville or Alum Creek in Delaware. The reason we know a lot about Ansel Mattoon and Ozem Gardner is this gentleman, Wilbur Henry Siebert, who was a professor at Ohio State around the turn of the century, made it his mission to speak to as many people who were either involved in the Underground Railroad themselves or were descendants of or children of those people. So he collected oodles of oral histories and letters, there are a lot of letters in that collection of people recalling being involved with Ozem Gardner and Ansel Mattoon. And for a long time, you couldn't access that collection. Within the last 5 or 10 years, the Ohio History Connection put it online so you can read it, and it was really exciting to start finding all our Worthington connections in those papers. Okay, so then we'll move on to the Worthington Inn. So this is a picture of the Worthington Inn when it was known as the Bishop House. This building to me is fascinating because when I first started working with our collections at the Society, I said, oh, someone's mislabeled this picture. This is not that house. And actually, it didn't even look like this to begin with. At the start, the house was only this portion, and it was built in 1835 by Rensselaer Coles, and he was married to Laura Kilbourne, James Kilbourne's daughter, and that was a residence for them. So if you had ever dined in the Worthington Inn, there was a room with a fireplace, a smaller dining room. That would have been their front room. So you'd go in the hall, and their sleeping quarters would have been on the second floor. And then in 1853, a man named Theodore Fuller purchased the house, and he basically did what we would say he flipped it, and he added the other half on and put a second entrance that could function as a reception for an inn. And then on the top floor, there's 3 windows. There were 3 bedrooms on the top floor for guests. So the innkeeper's family could continue to live in the original residence and use the new half for an inn. And so that's when it flipped to become the Bishop House. And then later it was purchased by the Van Loon family, who renamed it the Hotel Central or the Central House. Its name changed quite a few times. And there were some other owners in there. And then in 1901, there was a fire, and the second floor roof burned. And George Van Loon, who was the owner at that time, took the opportunity to update the building to what the current style was. And so we get the more Victorian look with the architecture, adding on the front porch, and then a third floor with a mansard roof to function as a ballroom with the tiles. And that's kind of what we all expect the Worthington Inn to look like. And I just like this picture of this large party standing in front of the hotel. And groups would come from Columbus to have parties in the ballroom, tally-ho parties, fraternities would come, family gatherings. They would sleigh ride here if it was possible. So it was a gathering spot for people from Columbus as well as a place for people to stay. And the Historical Society has these giant registers that everybody signed in, and people like Harvey Firestone from Detroit and different big names came and stayed here as well. And then this is a picture from, I want to say the 1960s when it was the New England Inn. And then a lot of people now remember also they would have buffet dinners, harvest, smorgasbords, things like that, before it was redone in the 1980s. Okay, so the Worthington Female Seminary was built in 1842. This was a 3-story building that was a school for girls, and it was built where the parking lot of the Worthington Methodist Church is now. And it was opened they started having classes in 1839, and then the building was opened 3 years later. People sent their children, their girls from like Vermont, Connecticut, all over Ohio to study here. It was the first Methodist female school west of the Alleghenies. So pretty important for people here to be able to educate their children. Mary Johnson was one of the students there. And it lasted until Ohio Wesleyan had a girls' school, and then they just couldn't compete. So it later became a school for teachers called the Ohio Normal School, and then was later converted to apartments, and then was torn down in the 1960s. So some other big important developments, the Cincinnati-Columbus-Cleveland Railroad passed 1 mile east of Worthington in 1851, so they start getting connected in to other communities to be able to move goods faster. Also in 1853, Elias Lewis began a horse-drawn omnibus line that went from Columbus Union Station and then came to Worthington. And the flyer boasts that you can now get to Columbus in 2 hours. So that kind of also illustrates just how difficult it was to be going to Columbus for anyone. It was a long trip there. But the omnibus line moved people, but it also moved mail and things that you might need, like doing business with Columbus. So I included this picture or this map from 1856 where you can see Worthington here and all of Sharon Township, how it's still largely farmland. Those big 60 to 80 acre farm lots are making up a large part of Sharon Township and the west, what's considered Worthington. But in 1856, Worthington annexed its first piece of land, the Morris Addition, which was from Morning Street out to what we call Andover now, and from 161 or State Street down to South Street. And that was the first land that was annexed into Worthington. And I also included the inset of the town because at that point they still were putting little boxes where all the brick structures and frame structures were. So you can see that the houses are still really concentrated on High Street and around the Village Green, and the outer edges of the, Worthington proper were still largely empty. And then in 1870, the government changed again, and we moved to a mayor, 6 council members, and a town clerk. And then here's just another map from 1883 that now includes that Morris Addition annex and the land where the manufacturing company had been annexed in. And then I just like to look at the population map or population chart that, 100 people came to Worthington in 1803. And then in 1830, when we have the first census records, there's 300 people. And 1890, there's only 341 people. So, for all those grand aspirations for Worthington to become the hub, it kind of got passed by. The National Road went somewhere else. The canal didn't end up coming here. And the population just kind of evened out. Even in 1880, when we see that spike, that's when the Ohio Normal School opened, and they had 100 students in teacher training. So it was a sleepy, rural town. And then in 1893, the Village Council granted the Columbus Electric Street Railway a right-of-way down the center of High Street. So the picture on the top left is a trolley car in the middle of the Village Green. And you can see the tracks at the bottom. That house is the house that's adjacent to actually you can see the Presbyterian Church with the steeple right on the side. And people could get from Clintonville and turn around in the public square. And then within 10 years, they extended the tracks to become the Columbus, Delaware, and Marion line that went all the way to Marion. So we start having a way for people to travel to and from Worthington faster, access the community, and we start to see growth, because by 1920, after the electric street railway got here, the population has gone to 705 people. All right, so I threw this map in here. This is new for me, but as we start thinking about Worthington growing, in the 1920s, the Federal Housing Administration started limiting who could live here. So this was a portion of a redlining map, and basically they evaluated what the makeup of the residents were in areas, and if there was a presence of African Americans or immigrants, and also industry, you would receive a lower rating. So Worthington was largely a B rating, which meant that there were some African Americans and immigrants here, but it was still considered good, and then, or okay, not declining. And then a C rating showed that the neighborhood was in decline. And so the northeast quadrant of Worthington was rated as a C, going all the way up to Worthington-Galena Road and out to the railroad. And so as we think of growth in Worthington, it is kind of interesting to think about people buying homes here. Their mortgages were restricted. How much money they could get mortgaged was restricted by what your rating was. So it became harder to invest in these areas because your mortgage insurance wasn't guaranteed. There are little blue dots everywhere where African Americans owned homes in Worthington, and purple dots where residences were rented. And then the yellow dots are where African Americans lived in white households as servants. And then there are 2 orange dots for where businesses were owned by African Americans in Worthington. And so this definitely does shape how Worthington grows after the 1920s. So here is the original plat for Colonial Hills in 1927, and some original pictures of what the proposed homes were going to look like. This neighborhood was platted, or part of it was platted, before the Depression, and then the plans were shelved because of the Depression. And then in 1941, the Defense Homes Corporation took over the project, but they scaled it back, and they came up with 9 original models that were designed by this gentleman, Todd Tibbles. They were all manufactured in New York and brought by train and then assembled in place. It was one of the first subdivisions that used gypsum instead of plaster to speed up the construction of homes. And so there's a nice picture, well, kind of grainy, but of the Colonial Hills and Dales neighborhood when it was first built in 1942. And it was built with the idea that workers from Curtiss Wright Air Force would have a place to, the construction workers would have a place to live. All right, and then so by World War II, population of Worthington was 1,500. And then by 1954, it's 2,500. So we have communities like Colonial Hills that are starting to grow. But then in 1956, Worthington and Colonial Hills both got to vote on whether they would be annexing Colonial Hills into Worthington. And that was a pretty contentious decision. If you look through the newspapers in 1954, the letters to the editor are not polite. People had a lot of opinions both directions. But it did pass, and the population of Worthington instantly jumped to 6,400, and that allowed Worthington to achieve city status. And so a charter was adopted to have the city council and the city manager government. And that was kind of the first example of these neighborhoods that started being annexed into Worthington and growing. And all of those neighborhoods did share a few things in common before, like in the 1940s and 50s, that there were lines in their deeds that there were restrictions on what kinds of businesses you could have, or that you couldn't have certain businesses, like you couldn't have soap business or a tannery or things like that in your home. You also couldn't have, you couldn't buy homes if you were not Caucasian, and then they would limit the size of your home. It had to be a certain size, a certain setback. So they started setting the tone for what neighborhoods would be like here. So there's how our population really took off after 1950, and then has plateaued. Like it ends in 1980, but the population has really stayed largely the same, or even maybe gotten a little smaller. In 1967, the Architectural Review Board was organized in Worthington after a lot of historic buildings started being taken down. So we've got the female seminary on the left, the Griswold Inn, both of them when they're being raised. And then, so the interest in thinking about what our community looks like and what we should be preserving was taken into account. And then in 1975 and 1981, 270 and 315 were constructed, which really also kind of hemmed in what we consider Worthington proper. And there was a deal made with Columbus about water provision, and if Worthington were to get their water from Columbus, then they had to agree not to annex any other land in. And so once that decision was made, Worthington was really not able to continue to grow its borders. And so we have what we have now. So we'll take a little break, and then after the break, I'm gonna talk a little bit about the different families that live in the Morris Addition. The Morris Addition was the neighborhood that was annexed in 1856 with the idea that retired Methodist ministers and free blacks would have a place to buy their own homes. It got a historical marker in October of last year, and so we'll talk about some of the families that live there. But stretch your legs, we'll be back. Okay. We'll go ahead and get started here with our second half. So I could probably talk about the Morris Addition for a really long time. I'm gonna tell you some of the different stories of the different families that live there. This is a project that I really started researching in 2020 during COVID, and I was kind of grateful for the time I got to just spend researching while we weren't doing events. Because I typically talk about, the Morris Addition was annexed in 1856, first annex into Worthington. It was established for retired Methodist ministers and free blacks to be able to purchase land and build homes. And then the question would be, well, who were those people? And I was kind of embarrassed that I didn't really know who those people were. Lots of different sources to do this research: census records, ancestry, the archives at the Historical Society, local newspapers, research by historians for the Historical Society in Worthington that have come before, and then a lot of deed research on the Franklin County Recorder's website, and also some trips to the Ohio History Connection archives and also the Worthington Town Council minutes that the city of Worthington holds at the city building. So I have that puzzle piece there because this is like a giant puzzle where you don't know where the edges are or if there even are edges, and just finding the little pieces and trying to kind of make sense and put it together. And every time I go back and do a little bit more searching, I find more pieces that make the puzzle even bigger. So here's that 1842 map. You can see Worthington was just that center portion, and the land that was to become the Morris Addition was 2 farm lots. And a man named Uriah Heath came to Worthington. He lived in the blue house. I call it the Demas Adams house. Some people call it the Bishop Adams Heath house, but it's still right on the southwest Village Green. And he was a Methodist minister who was one of the founders of the Worthington Female Seminary. He purchased the land that was going to become the Morris Addition from McCullough Morris and Company in 1854 for $4,000. Heath also acted as an agent for the newly formed Wilberforce University, which is the nation's oldest private historically Black university, owned and operated by African Americans. So they bought the land from Morris McCullough Company and named the annex the Morris Addition. So it was kind of interesting to know that Cavalry Morris lived in Athens, Ohio. He served in the state legislature. He was elected as a Whig to Congress. He worked in Cincinnati in mercantile pursuits, was a partner with George McCullough, and then moved back to Athens and was a probate judge. Never lived in Worthington. Hard to tell if he came here at all, but that appears to be who they named this subdivision after. So it was the first subdivision annexed in 1856. So I was hoping there would be lots of details in the town minutes. This is something I talk about with people often, that you go into these minutes and they say, this land was annexed in, that's it. No discussion, no great thoughts about it. Okay, but it is in there. And so this is the map of the addition. State Street is now Granville Road, 161, goes down to South Street. And the Morris Addition was divided into 120 half-acre lots. And of the 124 lots that were platted in 1856, at least 23 of the lots were owned by African Americans between 1859 and the turn of the century, which works out to about 18.5%. That is significant because in the 1880 census for Sharon Township, and that's the entire Sharon Township, the population was 1,620 residents, and only 100 of them were African American, or 6%. So the idea that this was founded to offer an opportunity for free Blacks to buy land and own houses seems to have come to fruition. So there are a lot of historic homes in the Morris Addition that have had a lot of research done about them. The Wright House, which is now Sharon Memorial Hall on the far left. There are some other houses that you might recognize that are still standing. The James E. Wright House is where the East Granville Road Park was torn down, which if anyone ever finds a photograph of that, it was torn down late enough that there should be a photograph, but I have never seen one. And I keep hoping one will turn up. But these have been talked about and researched quite a bit. So we'll look at some of the other stories of some of the other homes. And this map from 1872 shows, well, they mislabeled it. They've got it as the Norris Addition. But you can see where houses were in 1872. So this is one very helpful resource for this project. And then that's a better close-up of that. Okay, so one of the first families we'll look at is Henry and Dolly Turk. And this name might be familiar to you because Henry and Dolly Turk lived on New England Avenue. They purchased 2 lots on New England Avenue in 1856 for $250 from the Wiley, Mason, and Lewis families. And those 3 families were very active in the Methodist Church. And so we think that Henry and Dolly Turk may have already been renting this property ahead of that, but they officially filed their deed in 1856. And a little bit about them. Most of what we know comes from this obituary that was printed in the Independent Observer, a really short-lived newspaper in 1881. Aunt Dolly Turk, an estimable colored lady of this place, was interred at the cemetery last Sunday. She was formerly a slave in the state of Virginia, where in the year 1838 she was purchased by her husband, Harry Turk, and they immediately came to Worthington, where she has resided up to the time of her death. Our citizens remember her as a good and kind-hearted woman. So they first appear in the 1840 census. Henry Turk was listed as a farmer. They had 7 children who were all living in Worthington. But they also purchased land in the Morris Addition. So they purchased the 3 lots that are circled there farthest east possible in that section for $175, and then later sold it for $230. They sold it right after Henry Turk died. So maybe they were planning on farming it and then didn't end up doing so or could no longer keep it after he passed away. But they did own some land in the Morris Addition. And then as you search for footprints of these people and trying to learn more about their lives, here was a civil action where Harry Turk was in a suit with, I think it's Wilcox. And this was at the Ohio History Connection in the county treasurer's records. So you start to find little pieces to see how people fit into the community. And I also included a picture of this book, Bone and Sinew of the Land, because I was reading this book talking about all these Black pioneers who came to Ohio, accumulated large farms that then were somehow, for various reasons, ended up getting their farmland taken away from them, had to pay bonds to stay in the state, and became bankrupt and had to sell their land. But in a speech I heard the author, Annalisa Cox, give, she was mentioning it's really important when you study history that you don't use, this was the first person to do this or the first person to do that, because then you stop looking for anything else. And so I had always heard from the time I started here that Henry and Dolly Turk were the first African Americans to own their own home. Done. And so then when I'm digging into this Morris Addition research, I come across Luke and Mary Farabee, and they had purchased land on Hartford Street, approximately where the library entrance is now, and they actually purchased their lots in 1855. So they got their deed recorded earlier than Henry and Dolly Turk. So it's kind of one of those things where that was really resonated, that we want to continue to look at, all the pieces of history and try not to say this is what happened and we don't need to do anything else, look any further. But the Farabees also purchased 2 lots in the Morris Addition in 1861. And so Luke, let's see, he was born in South Carolina. Mary was listed as an Indian born in Georgia, and it's always interesting with census records. You don't know what that's at the discretion of the census taker, so her race changed between different census. And then after Luke passed away, she lived with her son, Lewis, and then she was left in 1880 on her own. She did a lot of odd jobs. She shows up in the Griswold book because her property abutted to the back of theirs into their day books, doing different odd jobs for them. Their son, Louis, is buried at Walnut Grove Cemetery. He was a soldier in the Company A of the 46th Regiment of the U.S. Colored Infantry and a member of the GAR. And I included that partly because it's also interesting to note that Walnut Grove Cemetery is one of the earliest documented places in Worthington where they've spelled out segregation, and that people of color were only allowed to be buried in Section A on Maple Alley in Walnut Grove, whereas earlier it hadn't been recorded. That was recorded in 1910. And so among others, John Hood and Jesse Clark are two other African-American veterans buried in that area who lived in Worthington, although these two appear to have come after the Civil War. Okay, so then we'll touch on the Scott family, and this family has a big story. So James and Harriet Scott came to Worthington in around, I think I'm going to say around 1860. They had a number of children. So William, who also went by Bev, James, Edward, Emma, Daniel, Mary, and then they had Mary, a domestic servant who lived with them as well. And when they first arrived in Worthington, James Scott purchased half of lots 9 and 10 on what's now Plymouth, so across the street from where the St. John African Methodist Episcopal Church is on Plymouth now. And so he purchased that land and built a house. James Scott also worked for the Griswold family. This is Worthington Franklin Griswold's expense book, and the yellow lines, all those different places he was paying Scott as a laborer for doing work. And then he ended up building this house at 184 East Granville, right where Plymouth dead ends. And he lived there with his second wife, Ada Kiner. His wife, Harriet, who came to Ohio with him, we have her manumission papers as part of the Historical Society collection. So when she was given her freedom, everybody gets one of these pages signed, and it describes her as age 22, and that she was, how tall she was, and that her complexion was yellow, and then also lists marks on her face and back. And then on the next page, in the will where she got her emancipation, lists her children's names. Beverly was 2 years old, and Emma was 10 months. So she came with James Scott. They ended up getting divorced. James Scott moved across the street and built the house that we just looked at. And then their son, Bev, built this house that stands still at 195 East Granville Road. We don't know, I don't have any information about where Bev was educated, but undoubtedly he was to some level. This is what the house looks like today that he built. He built the back half first, similar to how the Orange Johnson house and a lot of these older houses in Worthington are, and then added the front on about 15 years later that faces Granville Road. He was a barber. He operated a barber shop out of that house. So the ads show that his business was on East Morning Street in Worthington. Actually, he had a couple different businesses because that's not that house. But and then he also was involved just in a lot of civic activities. So he shows up in the Westerville Public Opinion in the Worthington column, and it says, one of our enterprising citizens commenced on Tuesday morning to erect a meat shop on the north side of Fuller Brothers Grocery. And then William Knox will have charge of the meat market. So if we look at this picture of Main Street or High Street in Worthington, standing approximately in front of the Worthington Inn, looking north, all the buildings on the east side have pretty much been torn down and rebuilt, but Bev Scott built this building here, approximately where the Whitney House is today. And so, prior to, 4 or 5 years ago, there were a few names of African Americans that lived in Worthington in the early 1800s, or in the 1800s, that we knew about, but really didn't know much about their contributions. And so to run across these little tidbits in the articles and start putting the story together that he owned a business. He's listed in the paper as going to city council with other businessmen who own businesses here, lobbying to get the roads conditions improved and the sidewalk conditions improved. Was very active in the community. His sister, Emma, owned 2 lots herself in the Morris Addition, those 2 lots that were earlier owned by the Turks. She graduated from Worthington High School in 1881 in a class of 3 people. Big classes, so those were the first classes, official classes. So she was in the second class to graduate. And then this map was drawn by Frank Corbin, who is a historian and was recording all the different families that lived down East State Street. So you can see Bev Scott is on the left of that red block, although a lot of people called him Bed and Beb. There was some confusion about what his nickname was. And then Mary, his sister, ended up owning the land that had originally been their parents'. And Mary graduated in the class of 1886. The class had really grown. The school had grown. We had 7 graduates that year. And also the brother, Daniel Webster Scott, graduated in 1886. And Daniel Scott owned a couple lots that faced Granville Road as well. And when he died, his obituary in the Dayton Herald mentioned that he graduated from Worthington High School and went to Oberlin College and taught school for a short time in Chicago. And then also mentions a story that he was the manager at the Madison Square Gardens for Harry Stevens' Peanut King restaurants. And I believe it says somewhere that one of the articles talked about, he invented the hot dog sandwich. So apparently Daniel Scott was really on the front edge of selling hot dogs. I did follow up on this. This is also just another interesting part of doing this kind of research. So I saw that he graduated from Oberlin, and I think, one at the top sentence, it says he's one of the first Negro graduates of Oberlin College. And so I reached out to them. Wow, this is exciting. What do you know about him? And they did show that he attended school there for a couple months, but he didn't graduate. And also, they graduated African Americans 40 years before he attended. So that's another kind of just thing to pay attention to when someone says, this was first. Well, okay, maybe. And that's not taking away from it, but that you got to be careful with those words flying around. And then I included here Jessie Scott Hathcock, who was one of Bev's 4 children. And so she grew up in Worthington. She went to high school here. She owned some of the land that her family had owned prior through 1943. And then she ended up living in Dayton. She was very active teaching in Dayton. Her obituary mentions friends who came to visit and stayed to talk to her classes at Dunbar High School included poet Langston Hughes, philosopher educator W.E.B. Du Bois, and early NAAC president James Weldon Johnson. And she has a really wonderful story in her own. And I have been trying to find family members, descendants of the Scott family, who might be able to talk to me about what they know about when the Scotts lived in Worthington. And that line kind of went cold. And then this is an example of why you just have to keep going back and stay up to date on this research, because earlier this year, I looked for her again, and in the end of 2021, University of Dayton dedicated a new hall, the Jessie S. Hathcock Hall, named after her because they have noted that she was the first African-American graduate from the University of Dayton in 1930. And in the information there, it mentions that she had to take night classes so as to not offend other students. So she did all of her courses in the evening, but did graduate. And so now they've named this hall after her, and some of her grandchildren attended. And so that kind of brought that research back up that we can have a new way to go, and found this really nice picture of her as well. So that was kind of exciting that after she graduated from Worthington, went on and did great things. All right, so the Carter family. There's a little blurb about Millie Austin, who was born Millie Carter, that she was one of the pioneer residents of Franklin County, having come to this vicinity from Wyandotte County 60 years ago, so that'd be in the 1830s, and that her parents, Henry Carter and his wife, settled in what was Grove City. And then it goes on to describe what Grove City looked like at that time. But eventually they did make their way to Worthington, and Henry Carter purchased land where the Worthington Manufacturing Company was, that part that was Garden Square, in 1866. And then he was married, and they had 7 children, including Millie. And then he also appeared to have owned some land on Hartford Street, near Hartford and South. Although I'm not sure that they lived there. I haven't really been able to find much more than that he owned that land. And his name shows up on the 1872 map. Also, you can find record of the Carter family in the Methodist church rolls. All the children, or a lot of the children, were members of the Methodist church, although not the parents. And it was also interesting to me, and this is what kind of always slows me down, is they've listed Joseph H. Carter, and they've put in parentheses C. Boy, which I was interpreting to mean that he was colored. But they didn't do that for all of the siblings. So sometimes you look for those clues, and then you miss other pieces. And then some of the places where they showed up in census records. This one was interesting to me. I've been looking for Millie Carter, what happened to her in 1860, and then found where she was living with another family, and her name is listed as Permelia Carter. So I feel 80% sure that's what happened to her in 1860, is she was working as a servant for the Goebel family. But then we find where she gets married, and she married a man named Anthony Alston. And I don't know if any of you are familiar with the Alston free slave story, but if up where the Alum Creek Dam is, where the Africa community is, there's a historical marker that tells about the Alston freed slaves, and they were brought, a group of Alston family were brought to Ohio, and they weren't freed until they got to Ohio, so as not to jeopardize their freedom. And most of them settled in Orange Township in this Africa area, but quite a few of the Alstons did end up in Worthington, including Anthony, who married Millie. And so Millie and Anthony bought the land on Plymouth Street, where the AME church is now. And they had a son, or she had a nephew. Millie had a nephew, Lyman, who also owned land in the Morris Addition. And we'll come back to them in a minute. Another person who owned three big plots in the Morris Addition was Nero Monroe. He purchased land from the Pingrees in 1868, and that was on New England and Plymouth. And he shows up in the Franklin, Clinton, and Sharon Township poll book list. So the Ohio History Connection has all the poll book lists of who voted in the different townships, and they've got them all listed for each, who voted Republican, who voted Democrat, and then they put the little note on the side. If they were African American, they've got colored listed. And then also Nero Monroe shows up in the newspaper at the trial of Nero Monroe in action for damages for the shooting of Mrs. Richardson's cow. Squire Griswold rendered a verdict for the latter in the sum of $18, and the case will probably be appealed. So before having done this research, as I read through these newspapers, I probably would have skimmed right over that. But then as we start looking for who these landowners were, then these little tidbits start filling in the story of each person. And then Nero Monroe's will is also available online, so we could find out a little bit about him there. This house was on New England Avenue until 2020, and it was torn down. And I got some calls because it's next to a really old house, an 18 teens house, and somebody got nervous that they tore down the teens house, and there was a lot of excitement, and then said, oh no, it was just a little house next door. I didn't know anything about the little house next door. But it was built in the 1860s. And in doing this research, discovered it was built by Alan Parks, who was an African-American. He bought the land and it was vacant, and then he took out a lot of mortgages to build this house. He lived there with his 2 daughters. And his children attended school while they lived in that house in the 1870s. And then we just lost the story. The house was sold eventually, or taken back, and then a lot of different families lived there. So it was kind of disappointing to learn that it was torn down and no one even knew it was going to be torn down. And we just lost the story or the chance to document the house or anything. So it was actually the catalyst for a new ordinance that Worthington passed, that any house that is going to be torn down in Worthington, if it's older than 75 years old, the Historical Society they have to go through a review process. So the Historical Society has time to document the house and take pictures and just make sure we know the story of what is being torn down. So we've gotten to document a couple properties since then, which has been good. Okay, so then Worthington's first African Methodist Episcopal congregation was established in 1897. So first they met in people's homes, and then after the congregation outgrew individual homes, they started meeting at the Oddfellows Hall, which is at the corner of Hartford, and it's behind the St. John's Episcopal Church. And then eventually they outgrew that space and wanted to have their own place to worship. So Millie Alston donated the land on Plymouth Street, and they moved a house from another property to become the church. And so this is that house, the interior. It was called Bethel AME Parish House at the time. And then in 1913, they had outgrown the house. So they had a man named Chester Hard, who lived right around the corner, was a carpenter, built 682 Plymouth Street, and renamed the congregation St. John AME Church. And so they recorded a lot of their own history in 1969 in this book, Forward the Brotherhood. And it is a huge resource, been a huge resource to identify families and follow all these different historical threads. So one of the people they outline in there was Peter Banks, who was another landowner in the Morris Edition. And he was the son of one of the founders of the AME Church, also named Peter Banks. And he purchased that land kind of adjacent to the church. And there are some nice pictures of Addie and Peter, and then Nora Clark, who was Nora Banks. Other landowners included D.H. and Rosa Taborn, who were founders of the church. They owned part of Lot 11. And there's an obituary in the Chillicothe Gazette. He was born in North Carolina. And then Charles and Elizabeth Bell, who owned 2 lots. They eventually owned the land where Alan Parks built the house, so they owned the Parks house. And then Elizabeth Bell sold some lots to Squire Todd. And Squire Todd is, there's a picture of him on the left when he was coaching a baseball team, and then also a picture of him in his feed store. He owned feed and transfer company that was approximately where the driveway by the Whitney house is. It was a little one-story building. I might have a picture of it coming up. And so he started that in 1914 and kept that until the Depression, and he was forced to close. Yeah, so it's the building, that little building. There's two different views of it right on High Street on the east side. And so here's an ad from the newspaper. Nothing too big for us to tackle. Local and long distance hauling. And then he had the house. This is a picture of the Methodist Church. There's been four different Methodist church buildings. So this was the second one, and it's where the chapel, Potter Chapel, is now. And you can see this little house, the Potter Wright House, just behind the church. And when they were going to tear this church down and build the new chapel, they needed that house moved. So Squire Todd picked it up and moved it to New England Avenue and used it as his own house. So that's what it looks like today. And it was moved in 1925, and the paper said he used a team of oxen to do that move. So this is the last slide I have for this. So far, all these lots in yellow have been identified as lots that were owned by African Americans in Worthington between the 1856 and the early 1900s, and there are probably more. And we just keep looking and building out the stories and learning more about the people who've lived there. So, thank you guys so much for listening to all this Worthington history. Happy to answer questions. Also happy to have you come visit our sites. I've got newsletters and some brochures up in the front. So, thank you very much. So if young women came to the female seminary, some of them stayed in that building. It was a residential building. So the 3 floors, they had classes and places to stay. But other students boarded with families. So like the Johnson family, we know they boarded a student for a half a year. So they had different options. No, that's a popular question. So what is happening with the Worthington Inn? What I do know is the second and third floor were combined into one residential unit. And then the first floor has to stay commercial use. So hopefully there's going to be a restaurant there someday. And then the other half had to be reserved for commercial use. It couldn't be converted to residential. But I don't know when that's going to happen. Yep. Yeah. Sure. So the Masonic Lodge is owned by the same people that own the Worthington Inn. So it's a commercial space. They were going to turn it into a condo, and the compromise was to not, but there's a yoga studio in there right now. And then the AME Church, the AME congregation still owns the church on Plymouth, even though they own another church on Campus View. And so they worship there, and then they rent the church on Plymouth to another pastor who holds services there. So that's still in the AME Church's hands. So it's open on occasion, and in September, the Ohio History Connection hosts an event called Ohio Open Doors, and the AME Church is going to open again in that September event, so keep your eyes out for that if you want to pop in. Great, thanks. Yeah? Redlining started in the 1920s, and so it was started by banks and then endorsed by the Federal Housing Administration, basically, and lasted through, those maps were made and the grades were assigned. And then in 1948, I think it was the Fair Housing Act kind of ended that, but the legacy of creating those neighborhoods, people didn't invest in neighborhoods that had low grades, so it could be immigrants, industry, and African Americans. And so they did this in a lot of metropolitan cities, and Worthington was, on the north side of Columbus. And a lot of the cities, like there's an exhibit called Undesign the Red Line that was done by the YWCA, and it was here in Worthington. It's still somewhere in central Ohio. You could definitely find it and go visit it. But to make those grades, they would have assessors go out and fill out papers that would say like why they gave different grades to different news areas. The Columbus pages were all lost. So why different areas in Columbus got the grades they got, we don't know. Whether those were burned or are in someone's attic or whatever, we don't know. But once those grades were assigned, then how people invested in those neighborhoods, because people couldn't get mortgages, people who had families lived in those areas for a long time could no longer afford to pass the properties on or to sell, and they would lose their accumulated wealth. And that shaped how our communities grew and changed. Yeah, it's a really interesting subject. There's a book called The Color of Law that I read recently, and it really goes through that in detail. So if you're interested, I would recommend that. Yeah?
I'm not a Worthington resident, so these are very basic questions.
Sure.
I'm curious why the name of the town became Worthington and not Kilbourne. I'm curious when Olentangy when the name of the river changed from the Whetstone to the Olentangy, and why. And on the very first map you showed, there were some parcels labeled S1, S2, and S3.
Okay.
Didn't talk about, but I was just kind of curious about what those were designated for.
Gotcha. Okay, so the town being named Worthington, in the toasts that they gave in 1803 in December when they got here, they said thank you to Thomas Worthington, who helped us secure this land. So because he was the land agent they worked with, there was some allusion to the fact he may have given some money to help them purchase the land as well. That's the most agreed upon reason they named it Worthington. But also there was a Worthington where a lot of the, in Massachusetts, where a lot of the Scioto Company people were coming from. So it's also been said they named it after Worthington, Massachusetts. And just my opinion, but it would be good to say both of those for these people if they're trying to do things in Ohio. Yeah, our town's named after Thomas Worthington. He was the 6th governor of Ohio. If you're out east trying to recruit people to come, it's named after Worthington, Massachusetts. It's just like home. So I'm guessing that maybe they used both. That was one. Oh, the Olentangy River. So I think similar, now this is not my expertise, but I think similar to a lot of rivers and places, the Olentangy is what the indigenous people called the river. Then they came and named it Whetstone, and then eventually reverted it back to the original name. And I don't know exactly when that happened, but it's an easily findable fact. And then, is this the one you were talking about? This one. Okay. Let me look. Like these? Okay. Oh, okay. Gotcha. Yeah, they're just all lot numbers. So the lot numbers, it is cool if you look at any deeds for any homes in that area, they always reference back to those original lot numbers. So it really helps when you're trying to research how land was subdivided, that they really stick to those lot numbers. Yeah. I have heard that they brought clay from the Olentangy River, and then I also know that There was a brickyard on Plymouth where the AME church is. That's where Amos Maxfield had his brickyard. So there may have been some clay coming from that area as well. Yeah. Yeah, there's a little clay in our area. Yeah.
This question is actually for Worthington residents. I live in Bexley. I have a friend who said that she had lived in a lot of places, a lot of different states, so on and so forth. Bexley is a very small community, like Worthington is a small community. And she said the only place she had ever lived where she had a sense of community was Bexley. And I'm wondering if that's true here.
Mother's class of 1944, this building, she's 97. I was born there.
What do you think?
Yes, I agree.
You agree that it's a sense of community?
Yeah.
Very much so. Yeah. We're fighting to maintain that and our identity, our historical identity, in the midst of lots of suburbs changing more urbanized.
I don't live in Worthington. I live in Westerville, but I obviously breathe, eat, sleep Worthington, and I definitely feel like there's a more sense of community here than in my own area where I grew up. So, yeah, John could probably speak to it.
Small is better.
My family moved to Worthington in 1832, and I am one of the last survivors around, but it's always been a very close-knit community. In the beginning, being away from Columbus, you know, Columbus in the old days stopped, you know, well, in 1870, when Ohio State was started, you know, downtown. Bexley is, you know, a lot closer to Columbus, but Worthington was a separate town. People just kept it that way.
Yeah.
I noticed on your pictures of James Kilbourne, his name is spelled differently than the school's. What happened that changed?
So we have a dictionary that belonged to James Kilbourne where he signed his name in the front of the dictionary, and he signed it multiple ways. Yeah. So he signed it Kilborn, and then sometimes with the U. There are Kilburns in West Virginia that are along his line that took the O out and are Kilburn. And then Lincoln Kilbourne, his son, added the E. So, but James Kilbourne had an E sometimes, so just spelling was a lot more fluid. Yeah. I was studying family, or trying to straighten out some genealogy for the Putnams, and they are buried, like the husband is Putnam and the wife is Putman. And so I emailed the descendant and said, I'm confused, something is wrong. And they were like, no, they used them interchangeably. And I was like, oh, that's so confusing to us because you can't spell names wrong anymore. But yeah, so I always spell Kilbourne without the E when I'm talking about early history, but Worthington thinks of it with an E now, for sure. Yeah.
Just, I think it's cool the fact that Route 23, according to WOSU's C-Bus, we're sending questions. The question a couple of years ago was, are there any old Indian trails that were back in the Indian days, you know, before Ohio was founded, that still exist? Guess what, Route 23.
Sure, yeah. Awesome.
Can you tell people about coming to visit you at the Orange Johnson House at the Historical
Sure. Yeah. So if you've never been to the old rectory, which is the Historical Society headquarters, it is on New England Avenue behind the Worthington Inn. And we have a parlor set up as it could have looked when the building was St. John's Episcopal's rectory. The building's been moved twice. And so you can, right now we have an exhibit of 5 1930s gowns, like day dresses, and we change the clothing out quarterly or twice a year. And then We also have a doll museum in that building. So there are 3, it's like a boutique museum. And right now we have Everyone's Best Friend as one of the exhibits with dolls that people remember. And Nikki has a doll on exhibit right now. And then we also have a gift shop. And then if you ever wanted to visit our archives to do research, we can always accept appointments to visit the archives. And then the Orange Johnson House is, like I said, beside the Dairy Queen, and it's open by reservation. So you can go on our website and make a reservation, or if you don't see a time that works for you, you can just give me a call or send an email, and we will set up an appointment for you to visit the Orange Johnson House. So there's some information about all of those sites here. And then you're always welcome to drive to Pleasanton Drive and visit the mound. John takes really good care of it. There's an outline of the longhouse that was there that he keeps in good shape. So I highly recommend doing that if you haven't done that before. We'd love to see you. Thank you, guys.